I wanted to tell you a story about something that I experienced around 25 years ago, which made a deep impression on me. And I used what I had learned, and I used that experience as something that was formative for me, that influenced how I understood how to work with groups of people and how to help groups of people move towards an objective, a goal that would be helpful to the group. And as the group of people one works with increases, that becomes more challenging. The experience I had was, how shall I say it? It was validated by other experiences I had in life consistently. And also it was validated by what I learned in the last 25 years from an academic standpoint. This story begins with the work of a woman named Marion Chambers, who lived and worked in a large city in Florida where I was the minister. And the city at that time had about 800,000 people. And Marion was well known by every politician, important politician in that city, by every important person in the educational system, by most of the powerful lawyers in that city, by members of the Black community, and just many leaders generally. And Marion also happened to be a UU, and she also happened to be the board president when I was there. Marion was a visionary. She was the CEO of what I believe was called the Community Foundation. It might have had another name, but it gave her a perch from which to exert her influence, and she did it very well. But one of the things that she did was that she studied major cities all over the world and asked the question, what makes cities healthy? How do you measure that? And there were people who did that. She did a lot of work on that, but she also came upon an idea that was relatively creative. And that is, she decided that she was going to create a committee, which later was called a peace committee, that would help solve any crisis or problem in the city that was occurring in any major institution of the city. So it was like a emergency doctor, if you will, to institutions that were in crisis to help smooth things out and to make the city a more hospitable place. And she was very skillful at that. And because, and only because, I happened to be her minister at the time, she brought me into that project. And I was alongside, or worked with, another person she knew quite well, who was a good Republican, shall I say, but on the conservative side. But he was a lawyer who had one big client in Tampa, and he was like a power broker in politics in Florida, and later became chief of staff for Jeb Bush, the governor. And the third person was an individual who was in the Florida state legislature and who was a Democrat and Jewish. The lawyer I mentioned was a Presbyterian. So there were me, the Unitarian, and the fourth guy was somebody I brought in who was a therapist who specialized in the problems of men. And men have a lot of problems, so he was a busy guy. Well, together we were called the Peace Committee. And so we did different jobs. But one day we were called upon to help the school board. Now, bear in mind, the school board catered to this population of 800,000 people because the county had the same geographical boundaries as the city in this particular place. And so the problem that had arisen was that the school board had commissioned a new sex education curriculum. And what they produced as news of this got out became incredibly controversial. And the report itself, or the curriculum itself, was highly professional, very neutral, did not encourage anyone to do any particular thing. It just provided objective information that young people need as they navigate themselves through adolescence and so forth. But the fact that the curriculum had openly and honestly dealt with issues like contraceptives, homosexuality, gay and lesbian issues, and those kinds of issues, that inflamed members of the community. And certain religious groups and conservative groups were saying, oh my God, the liberals are trying to take over our children's lives. This is a Trojan horse. They're coming into the inner sanctum of the lives of our children, and they're teaching them this stuff. Never mind, it was stuff that was factual about life. They're teaching them this stuff, even though it was done in a very neutral way. And we can't allow that to happen. So there was an unbelievable controversy about this. And so we were called to help. And being naive and idealistic and delusional, we jumped right in. So what happened is that we worked with the school board, although they kept the distance from us. They said, like, go ahead, do this for us. We'll be right behind you. And of course, we were the ones doing it. So the school board organized these meetings all over the city, and everybody who was a power broker or who represented a constituency was invited. All the ministers of the city were invited. Every member of any political group was invited. And on top of that, the general public was invited. And so hundreds of people showed up at these various meetings. And in the meetings, we would take sections of what had been written. We would break into small groups, and then they would discuss, those small groups would discuss what they had seen, and then they would come back to the larger group. We would discuss what had been concluded or thought about the issues, and then that material, which was somewhat filtered, would then be sent to the school board. So the school board and the superintendent could say, we talk to the people before we let this curriculum out into the world. Well, let me tell you that never in my life have I experienced a torrent of emotion like I experienced in those meetings. And I met people and talked to people and listened to people who you would have thought must have their beliefs prevail or the whole world would end. I don't know how else to describe it. Now, interestingly enough, as I talked to dozens upon dozens of people, because I was one of the people that led these small groups that met in the big group. And let me also say that before we got involved in this, we were all trained by someone who had worked closely with Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa. So we had some tools. We weren't just entering into this blindly. And everybody took it very seriously, and that Republican lawyer was incredibly devoted to this. and really gave his life and his time to this cause in a very neutral and mature way. But anyway, I slowly began to see certain patterns as I worked week after week with this group. First of all, I began to realize that there was tremendous diversity among each of the groups, the liberal side and the conservative side. That there were all kinds of nuances in the groups. And the more you talk to individuals, the more you realize that every single person had a nuanced opinion. And even though they seemed to act as though they were in a block, they really had individual opinions. And that was very important. The second thing became incredibly important to me and has throughout my life. It wasn't just that people had political views that they could discuss and communicate and they advocated for. And it wasn't just that their views were nuanced, but it was that there was an emotional quality to how people acted, which made them different from one another, but there were parallels between each of the groups. Let me explain what I mean by the emotional differences. Each side, and bear in mind there was a lot of nuances in the side, but each side had a group that was inflexible, that was unable to negotiate, that demonized the opposition, that tended to be highly suspicious of anybody outside their circle, and they generated an enormous amount of emotional intensity. That's where the emotional intensity of the whole experience came from, is one group. I will call that group one. Each side also had a second group. This group was not inflexible. They were not emotionally intense, but they were profoundly influenced by the people around them. Their opinions, it was as though they could not think on their own, and they were borrowing the thinking and beliefs of others to provide for them their opinions. And the interesting thing about this is that they could change their opinions if their group changed its opinion. And they moved in a pack or a herd or in a block. And they did not move outside that realm. But they could shift. The first group I mentioned couldn't shift. The second group could shift under the right conditions. The preservation of togetherness, of the feeling of togetherness, predominated. They checked continually with what the other person was thinking by looking at them, by trying to read the body language of the others so that they could get their own orientation. The third group was much smaller than the first or second group. The persons in this group had carefully thought through positions based on their own independent thinking. They were grounded within themselves, on the process within themselves that they had chosen to discover what was true and real. They understood that other people think differently from them, and it did not bother them. They would endeavor, this third group would endeavor to persuade other people of their opinion, but they were not fixated on the need to convert the other person. They understood that the reality of life is that people in numbers must find a way to come to an agreement to be able to move forward for the good of the group. And they were okay with that. They didn't have a need for their particular mindset to be dominant. Well, they also maintained their convictions. Here's the interesting part. Maintained their convictions while they faced and were among people who had different viewpoints. Members of this group, I found out, were small, but essential to the work we were trying to do. In fact, I realized that the Peace Committee really couldn't do anything, but the only thing it could do of value is to help clarify this third group of people and support them in doing what they could do for the larger group. Now, if I would quantify the numbers of people in each group, using 100 people as the number, I would say 20 people were in the first group, 70 were in the second group, and 10 in the third group. But it was as though people could move along a spectrum, so the lines between these three groups was somewhat blurred and could shift. Each of the two major ideological sides, liberal and conservative, had representatives of all three groups as defined by their emotional responsiveness, their capacity to make decisions calmly and to engage with others calmly. One of the most important lessons I learned was for there to ever be any forward movement and resolution with any group of people, the third group of each side had to come together, work out what they thought was a workable compromise, and then sell it to everyone else. The people belonging to the third group of each side, which is much more diverse than one can define by using the word side, but the two sides, the third group of the two sides had to come together and were able to freely talk with one another. And their main topic of conversation was complaints about the people in their group to each other. Oh my God, they're so inflexible. And to work out strategies to deal with one another. That was an eye-opener to me. The third group exhibited a high tolerance for diversity alongside possessing strong and clear personal convictions. The paradox of having simultaneously strong convictions while being able to be calmly with others who have different opinions and convictions was a key factor in the process of resolution. By demonstrating a willingness to be guided by principles rather than emotional turmoil or group pressure, by showing self-control and personal responsibility, and showing also a capacity to listen deeply to others. By this means, the essential leadership was provided that made agreements among all participants possible. Over decades of experience, I have come to see the dynamics that I've just described in great brevity to characterize all groups. Certainly every UU congregation I have worked with, or any other type of group I have worked with. If the anxiety in a system is low, the third group can operate effectively. If anxiety is high, then the first group and to some extent, the second group predominates. We live in a country today where the third group is unable to operate. And people in the first group dominate the field of relationships. And that is one of the core reasons we are where we are. I stress that if any group of people wants to break out of the cycle of going around and around in a circle and move forward to something new, creative, and different, the third group must lead them there. By having a covenant, by regularly reminding yourself, as you did this morning, of that covenant, by having a clear governance structure, as you were doing, by empowering your staff, which is an enormous resource of insight and understanding of the congregation, by creating clear boundaries and responsibilities for all, you are opening up a space for people in the third group to emerge and operate and do what they can do for the good of the congregation. An active third group that has influence is absolutely essential to the functioning of a congregation. I say this unambiguously with the greatest possible certainty, based on my education and my direct experiences. You are headed in the right direction in every way. Don't stop. Keep going. And don't look back.